Here we're going to look at an article titled Ethics of the Attention Economy, The Problem of Social Media Addiction by Vikram Bhargava and Manuel Velasquez. This is going to take a look at the incentives of social media platforms that exploit the users and turn the users actually into commodities to be sold, and whether or not this is ethical. So we should understand that the first claim is that some social media companies render their platforms in a way that actually makes them addictive. So typical businesses, if we look at, Walmart, Piggly Wiggly, if they still exist, Nike or something like that, right? These businesses, or a restaurant, right? They sell their products to the users of said products, right? So who is the actual customer? It is the person who's going to buy the shoes and wear the shoes, or it's the person who's going to buy the food and eat the food, right? To be profitable, though, social media companies must keep users on their platforms to sell their attentions to the social media customers. So something different occurs with social media companies. The ones who use the platform, those who use Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and so on, they're not actually the customers. They're not the ones that are giving money to the social media companies. It is actually advertisers that buy buy the user's attention. Now, the authors of this article argue that this is a form of addiction. They say that social media companies must make their platforms addictive to users because to make money as a business, they need advertisers to pay money to advertise on their platforms. And to do so, the advertisers want users who are going to see their products. And to make more money, they have to keep customers there for longer. That's the incentive, keep users there as long as possible. They need to keep the users of the products engage with the platform to interact more with advertisements. Now, the understanding of addiction, right? They need to prove that this actually is an addictive activity. Addiction, they say, has 6 components. One, a salient activity, so like the act of smoking a cigarette. Mood modification, so cigarette, for example, oftentimes, maybe gives them a little bit of energy boost, but it also relaxes them. Tolerance goes up, so if you smoke a cigarette once, it's probably maybe going to make you lightheaded. After that, you get used to it and you smoke more and more cigarettes. There's a kind of withdrawal after a certain amount of time. Your body's kind of really aching and desiring to have another cigarette. This can cause conflict with people due to the withdrawal, due to the desires and the tolls that it affects on the person in many different ways, emotionally and physically. It can cause conflict with family or other friends. And of course, in trying to deal with this addiction, there's often relapse. So they say the components of addiction result as a consequence of social media use. That when someone, for example, uses Facebook, all of these same components remain. That there is an activity of scrolling through the page, engaging with things, making comments and sharing things. There's a change in mood. Oftentimes it can be a sense of relief. Over time, though, it ends up making people unhappier. Tolerance goes up, so people end up spending more and more time on social media. Oftentimes, if people haven't been, check, their Facebook in an hour or whatever, right? They're kind of itching to check what new is on there. There's the problems with withdrawal, conflict, especially conflict we can think of with other family or friends on the site, and arguing over certain posts or things like that, which actually can be an incentive by these companies to keep people engaged and so on. So they argue social media companies render their platforms in a way that actually makes them addictive, that is what is necessary in making money. The next claim is that social media addiction should be treated as a serious moral problem, similar to, for example, alcohol or cigarettes. So first they say harm results from social media use. that we have already the examples of addiction from social media use, but we can also look at other things like studies show poor performance at school results from social media use. People have a difficulty remaining engaged in schoolwork. Poor work performance, the same thing. The more time people spend on social media, the unhappier they are, and oftentimes they can become depressed, and family and social life suffers. So harm results from social media use. Now, because of this harm, it's wrong, they argue, to use social media platforms to addict users. And it's not the case that we could say these harms are justified by the benefits those technologies produce, because they say much of the communicative and social interaction benefits social media platforms deliver can be produced without addictive mechanisms, that we can still use social media for communication without having the advertisements, and of course what the advertisements need is continually increased engagement by the users, right? So just because of the use value these technologies have doesn't mean the harm is justified. Now, they then say the harms that result are similar to those that result from other addictive substances. We've already gone over the characteristics of addiction, and these all apply to social media. So social media addiction, they say, if we want to say there need to be regulations and so on, and it would be wrong, for example, of tobacco companies to push cigarettes onto children and so on, same approach should be taken by social media companies, that social media addiction should be treated as a serious moral problem, just like alcohol or cigarette addiction is treated. Now, there are two further claims here. Addicting users to social media is impermissible because it unjustifiably harms users in a way that is demeaning. So this is where it goes beyond what tobacco or alcohol companies do. So the argument goes like this. First, social media companies use adaptive algorithms that continuously refine their platforms to become addictive for each particular user. So what they do is they gather information from, let's say, me and the things I end up clicking on, and they know how to focus in on my habits to increase my engagement. So they use myself against me. Now, other addictive substances like cigarettes do not have this ability to be, addictive in a particular way that only works for that individual, that can maximize then the addiction of that individual for that substance, right? So this is where it goes beyond other kinds of addictions. Furthermore, social media companies add insult to injury because they get the user to contribute to social media's ability to be addictive to their self. That the social media company uses then that individual's own self and their behavior and their engagement in it to further then themselves being caught in this addictive trap. That means, they argue, social media addiction is impermissible because the user is not only harmed, but also personally demeaned by being used against oneself. And the last claim we're going to look at is that addicting users to social media is impermissible because it unjustifiably harms users in a way that is exploitative. So, they argue to exploit someone is to make use of someone for one's own ends by playing on some weakness or vulnerability they have. So if I see a child and I know a child doesn't really have much self-control, and I can say, hey, I'll give you a piece of candy if you go and take that other person's phone from them or they're not looking and give it to me, I'm exploiting that child because I know they're not really aware of what it is I'm asking them to do, and they don't see how they're caught in this scheme that I'm using them as a mere means, right? A means to my own end in a way that's not giving them the respect they deserve as a human being. Now, of course, we have to mention the caveat that not all forms of this exploitation are impermissible, right? It's not always bad to take advantage of someone else, a vulnerability they might have. If we look at basketball, it is not wrong to exploit another person by taking advantage of their vulnerability, right? If we have someone we're playing basketball against and they're really not a good defender, and so I use that against them to score goals or baskets, Um, there's nothing bad about that. But it's different with social media. Social media users are exploited in an impermissible way, unlike with the basketball example. And the reason was two reasons, actually. Internet is pervasively important for our lives, that we actually increasingly cannot do without internet. It's a way in which we communicate to loved ones. It's a way in which we might communicate or sell ourselves for business or promote ourselves in ways that our livelihood is simply inseparable from the internet and social media, that we can't just give it up, and that is used against us. Furthermore, social media platforms use the necessity then of their platform as a vulnerability, right? They use that against users in a way that they can't practically opt out of, so to speak, is where the basketball player, of course, can opt out of playing basketball if they're not that good, and it doesn't necessarily mean their livelihood is going to be put into jeopardy. But in a society which requires increasingly people to be on the internet, it's just not really feasible for people to just opt out of using social media. So these are all the reasons of why there is an ethical obligation on the part of social media companies to not constitute their platforms in ways that make them addictive and that demean and exploit their own users, that they can exist without doing this, and they have an ethical obligation to do so.